Talking about growing root crops. And root crops really belong in every garden and in every pantry. They have a great potential for yield volume per square foot and per input cost. They're highly efficient crops in terms of eating what you grow. Not all, but a goodly chunk of them are grown during the off season as winter harvest or even occasionally as overwintered crops. Which means you're not taking up valuable tomato real estate with all of your root crops, though some of them are. But they're very space efficient. This is not typically crops that you're going to be growing in a long strung out row. You're going to be putting a little patch here, a little patch there. That being said, some of them are very large plants and they take up a lot of space in the garden. So efficiency is a relative term when we talk about space efficiency. The root crops all have some characteristics in common. They all require a fairly substantially deep soil plan to work with. You're not going to grow them in a really shallow raised bed. These little 8-inch or 10-inch or even some cases 12-inch raised beds are not really deep enough for some of these root crops. You need to have access to soil deeper than that. There are a few that aren't as picky about that. The soils need to be relatively loose in the sense that clay inhibits the development of good root systems. Now, I grow on heavy clay native soil. There's ways to work with it. But you do have to do that amending. You have to get that soil broken up and loosened up or the roots don't develop appropriately. The crops vary quite a bit in how much footprint they have above ground, but even on relatively small root crops in terms of their above ground foliage, you need to allow for adequate spacing for development. And we see this mostly like with onions and garlic in particular, where you think you can put them closer than you can. You can put them pretty close, but at a certain point, there's a diminishing return where they're competing with each other for necessary nutrients and water, and they don't do as well. So adequate spacing and adequate weed control. A lot of these root crops really resent competition from weeds as well. You have options for planting them. A few of them plant fine in rows, and that is done, but I tend to use them in irregular shaped patches to kind of fill in the garden rather than trying to do long linear layouts. And the whole thing about row farming or row gardening, that's agriculture. They do that so they can mechanize everything. It is not a more efficient use of space in your garden. It is a more efficient use of labor dollars when you're talking about acreage rather than square feet. So bear that in mind when you're looking at your garden as a whole, that there's definitely advantages to not making these long straight rows. It is important you understand the vegetable families for good crop rotation. And I just always like to remind everybody of the Great Potato Famine, right? So why did the Great Potato Famine happen? Well, they grew potatoes year over year in the same soil, no limit or no fallowing period, and they got away with it for years and decades until suddenly they didn't. They built up enough concentration of pathogens in that soil that the crops were infected with these disease organisms. And because that was all they'd ever planted there, and that's monocrop the whole area, it just went wildly through the entire crop and wiped out huge amounts of agricultural production. Same thing can happen in your garden. These crop families all share the hosting of pest and disease problems. So it's very important to not plant the same or very closely related crops in the same soil season after season, but you rotate, you put different crops in, or you do a fallowing period where you're not gardening to allow the soil microbiology to shift and to not have these concentrated pathogens. Now, a lot of these crops can be dry gardened with reasonable success, but consistent watering is important for many of them. And it's not always the ones you think that would be as wet loving as it turns out to be. Beets are a classic example. If you're growing beets for greens, you don't really need to water them. If you're growing beets for beets and you want decent beets, they really don't dry farm well. You really need to irrigate them. Reasonable fertility is important. Different crops have different needs in the nutrients. For example, the brassica root crops like turnips and rutabagas, and particularly the allium root crops like onions and garlic, actually need a pretty good amount of nitrogen, not just phosphorus. In general, root crops like phosphorus. That's a key part of developing that root crop. So fertilizers that have phosphorus, but for hungrier crops, Make sure there's adequate nitrogen availability as well. It's very important. The soil structure should be loose-ish. A little bit of heaviness is not a bad thing. It helps retain moisture in, but really heavy soils inhibits root development. Really, really fluffy soils or really, really sandy soils also have some challenges growing root crops, again, depending on the crop a little bit. So a good balance, some mineral soils, they include some larger particles like some sandy material, some very fine particle clay, and a good amount of humus in organic mass into the soil is what you want to do. And that's broadly true across vegetable gardening in general, but it's a little more important to pay that attention to in the root crops. So we talked about rotating. Here's the families of vegetable families and the root crops and the other vegetables you're likely to run into. We can't unfortunately get into every possible member of these families. Some of these families are huge, but it gives you some idea of what you're likely to have in your garden and things that you should be avoiding planting in succession and one after the other. So the chennapods. Chennapods are beets in your root crop, and you're likely to have spinach or chard or possibly orac. Those are crops you might have in the garden that are not root crops that are chennapods. Lamb's quarter is another one. Well, not that many people intentionally grow lamb's quarter, but there are some edible forms. The crucifers are your broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage family, a huge group of plants. There are several root crops in that family: radishes, turnips, and rutabagas. There's a lot of non-root crop vegetables in that family, all the mustard and those related greens, arugulas and all of those, kale, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, that whole alliance, you should be careful. And that's one of the ones that's particularly prone to some serious disease issues. So be very careful about those rotations with those and make sure you're not following a crucifer with another. The parsley family are carrots and parsnips in the root crops. The only other major veggie in that crop is celery, but a whole batch of herbs, and enough people interplant herbs into their vegetable garden, it's worth discussing. The whole batch of the herbs, cumin, cilantro, parsley, dill, those are all the parsley family as well. Lovage a little less frequently planted. Nightshades we're more familiar with, often their other vegetables: tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, and eggplants. The root crop is potato. So watch that one. That's another one where the pathogens can build up to a significant level. One that we worry about a lot. Alliums. So the root crops in allium are shallots, onions, and garlic. The other major vegetable is leeks, but also the herb chives. And there's a whole batch of minor crops. Ramps, ramsons are still alliums. The frequency of disease problems from not rotating alliums is not super frequent. But when problems do occur, it can be extremely long-lasting. If you get white mold into your soil from improper rotations, not being careful about planting certified sources, it is possible that you cannot grow alliums in that soil for out to 10 years or so. So it can be a serious problem. So pay attention to it. Root crops in the morning glory family. There's very little in the morning glory family we eat, but sweet potatoes is a morning glory. So that's kind of a covering of the crop families, and I'd like to go through, just do a breakdown of these major root crops. I'm sorry, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on yacon and aca and those. They're just too minor a crop, and it gets to be a long talk as it is. But we'll talk very briefly about some of those other options at the end. So beets. Beets are an early plant crop, and they can be planted in succession for different harvests throughout the season. You can also plant quite late in the summer for a fall crop, so that you have a wide variety of potential seasons of harvest for beets. There's a lot of great varieties of beets to play with. I'm a big fan of Flat of Egypt myself. It's a shorter, not so deep, and kind of squat beet that actually holds in the ground pretty well if you only pick a few at a time and leave them in. And that's kind of a valuable consideration, especially on the fall end of the cycle. Lutz is grown, although it does tuber up to, is grown extensively for leaf. Bull's blood. Chioggia is a fun one. It's zoned, so you've got the red beet, but every other layer is white. So when you cut into them, you get this bullseye pattern of red and white, red and white, red and white. Old-fashioned variety, really solid. Early Wonder is still probably the most widely planted, although you see some Table Ace and some other major varieties out there as well. So what beets like is a relatively neutral soil. Usually we're trying to maintain that in the garden anyway, usually not too big a deal. Just don't get severely acidic and you won't have any problems. Despite the fact that the beet you're harvesting is only about 3 inches or so, the taproot on the bottom of that beet goes down to about 12. So you do need to have that kind of space under them. That being said, a 12-inch raised bed is suitable for beets. That's not true for all the root crops. But as long as you have that 12 inches, you can make it work. Unlike a lot of vegetable crops, beets will tolerate a little bit of shade. In fact, that often increases some of your overall quality of plant, helps keep the roots cool. Beets, like several other chennopods, have kind of an interesting characteristic. When you plant a seed, you're not really planting a seed. When you're planting a beet seed, you're planting a dried up berry, basically. And there's like 5 or 6 seeds inside that berry. So for every seed you plant, you get multiple seedlings that come up. That makes thinning absolutely essential. If you do not thin, you will not get beets. It's critical. So typically what we'll do is direct sow them. Yes, you can start them and transplant them, start them inside and transplant them young, but because they're really not very picky about soil temperature, that's usually not the desired planting method. So if you plant your seeds shallow, 1/2 inch or so into the ground in a well-prepared site, about 1 inch apart, and you'll then thin them down to that basically 5-inch, 6-inch spacing after they start developing out. So fairly high failure rate from seed to finished beet, but seed is inexpensive and easy to do that with. Unlike most roots, you can transplant the seedlings, and I've done it. If you're going to do that, you want to catch them very young, about 4 weeks post-seeding after they're just up and growing. And I typically separate them out from the cell packs underwater so I can actually pull them apart a little bit more. Don't try to get them all the way down to singletons. Get them in little bunches of 3 or 4, plant them out like that, and then thin 4 or 5 inches apart, and then thin to the best single seedling after you've had a week or so in the ground. For in-ground direct sowing, it's really important you keep that moisture consistent during its germination cycle, because if they dry out anywhere in between, that's likely to inhibit germination. Really, for April plantings, late March plantings, that's really seldom an issue. But if you're doing it on the other end of the cycle and you're seeding your beets in July and August, which is really common, you might have a little struggle getting to germ. In other words, if you're just running a timer on your irrigation system, you're likely to need to supplementally water the seeded patch of beets to make sure it has enough water for good germination. So normal seedling development to seed leaves come out. You get the first true leaf about a week after the seedling leaves emerge, the seed leaves emerge. When you've got 2 or 3 true leaves, that's the time to thin. Watering, they're not super thirsty. But as you hit, so we think of this crop that's like a 50, 60 day crop roughly, at about halfway through, about usually somewhere around week 4, up the watering. As they're trying to swell up the beet, they must have some nice consistent watering. Doesn't need to be heavy, just can't be mixed. And that's why they don't dry garden super well. They like a little bit of nitrogen, but the really emphasis for beets is on phosphorus and potassium. That's true of a lot of the leaf crops. Or root crops, pardon me. Leaf miners. So all chennopods get these leaf miners. It's a little fly that lays its larva on the leaf surface, lays its egg on the leaf surface. The larva tunnels through between the layers of leaf, leaving these transparent areas in the leaf. Does a fairly significant amount of damage and is hard to control. They're inside the leaf by the time you notice them, and you can't really get insecticides into where they are. Early seedings of beets are much less likely to have leaf miner problems. The leaf miner population builds over the course of the summer. Late plantings of beets, this is a very common problem. So normal process in my world for handling leaf miners in beets and also in chard and occasionally in spinach. If they keep the spinach picked, it's not such a big deal. Individual leaves, when you see the tunnels forming, clip it out. Or if you have a lot of tunnels forming in a leaf, take that leaf out, get it out of the garden. Don't throw it in your compost pile, get it away. When those larvae hatch out, you don't want them coming right back to that same crop area. If this is a chronic and ongoing problem in your garden, insect barriers. It's like the Remay floating row covers, these spun or woven row covers. This can stop the flies from coming in and laying the eggs. And the lighter weight ones that are typically used for insect control in the summer aren't too heat generating, so you'll be okay with them. So beets are often grown for greens. Beet greens is kind of a special treat in the salad. You can grow for greens, you can grow for beets. You can grow for both, but if you're growing for both, limit your harvest to about 3 leaves per beet plant for greens harvest, so you won't starve out your developing beets. Ideal size of harvest is around 3 inches, somewhat a little under that is fine. That's usually about 60 days, depending on variety. You can assume that per row foot of planting, we should get something around a pound of beets if everything's working out smoothly. Beets do ground store reasonably well. They are subject to a number of soil insect pests if you leave them in the ground for very long periods of time, so be aware of that. But they do keep sizing a bit. And once you get beyond about 4.5 inches on most variety, they start getting porky and tough, and they're no longer of as good a quality. So don't overdo the ground storing of them, but they'll hold for a while. When you're picking your beets, it's a good idea to get them out of the ground in the cool part of the day, wash them clean. We normally cut the tops, but leave the roots and air dry them. Once they're air dry, throw them in the produce drawer in the refrigerator in a plastic bag. They'll hold weeks to months potentially. They've got a pretty good storage life refrigerated. So cold and humid storage is the rule. So beets can be seeded as early as March, April. Carrots need a little bit more soil temperature for good germination. So that means April. Now, I'm giving you these dates, but bear in mind, you have to be able to prepare the soil. And in a raised bed, you might be preparing the soil as early as late March, early April. In my world, this is May. My wet soils out in Northeast Corvallis do not till well, do not work well until we've got some drier weather. So that's the front end guideline is one thing. Just bear in mind that soil workability is a limiting factor as well. So if you're planting early April through maybe mid-May, you're talking about summer to late summer harvests. If you're planting carrots in June or July, you're talking about fall harvest, so October, November harvest. I had a really good November crop this year. It was very good. There are a few select varieties, notably Merida and Autumn King. You might find a few others, but those are the common ones we see, that you can plant in September to harvest in May the following year as an overwintered crop, April to May as an overwintered crop. Valuable because we tend to have a food dearth in the spring. In the summer, you've got all the crops coming off. Fall is heavy inundated with food. Fall and into winter, we have at least a few winter crops. Late winter, things are diminishing, but you have all the stuff you stored. By March, your stores are running low. Nothing's happening in the garden yet. It's just barely beginning. So having some crops that come on early like that is very valuable for food self-sufficiency. They prefer a relatively neutral soil. They'll tolerate a little bit more acidity than beets. They need to be really deep, 15 inches or so of soil depth under them, because they are a taprooter. Now, there are some smaller varieties like Denver's half-longs or orbit type carrots that can be grown in shallower soil profiles. So if you want to do carrots and you really don't have that option of depth, do look at some of those varieties. You sow the seed of your carrots really dense, and my favorite thing to do when I had younger kids was to prep the site in a nice loose patch and just give them a handful of carrot seeds and to show them how to just pinch and toss and pinch and toss. Because you want, 4 or 5 seeds per inch on carrot seeds. My frustration with carrot seeds is they take forever to germinate. So even under good soil temperatures and conditions, they don't germinate for like 21 to 28 days. That's the first greens showing post seed. And I'm that kind of impatient gardener that I'm out there at 2.5 weeks saying, I don't see anything. I better put some more seed down. And then about a week after I put the seed down, I got the original seeding is finally coming up, and yeah, so don't do that. Don't be me. It does take that long, and in the spring cycle, that's really not an issue so much as just a patience thing. But for the summer plantings, it means you have to be consistently watering them. You're sowing right on the soil surface. They dry out really fast. You have to be really consistent in your watering game for a solid month to get your carrots going. That being said, once carrots are sprouted and tapping down, they don't really need water. I've dry gardened them a number of times. After you put the seed down on the soil surface dense, it's a good idea to put a very, very thin, like 1/8 of an inch covering over the top. But it's got to be something that doesn't crust up when it gets wet and then dries down. I actually like bagged potting soils for that. Coir fiber would be another really good choice for that. Fairly fine composts work good. A lot of the more woody composty materials do not make a good seed cover for carrots because they do crust up a bit, and a lot of the native soils crust up if you're using them as your top cover. So just be cautious. In theory, you don't really need to top cover them. I find it holds the moisture in a little bit better. Regardless of the situation, with 21 plus days to germination in a nice sandy, well-prepped patch, I find the cats like it as a litter box, so I'll often put either cross-hatch of sticks or a little bit of chicken wire across the seeded area to keep the cats off of it until it gets up and growing. A real frustration. Some good varieties, Bolero and Mokum, are solid and slightly quicker varieties. Ya is solid. Nelson's one of the classics out there. I do a lot of Danvers with my heavy soils, and the fact that I like to dry garden, and Danvers is a really solid performing variety. So you'll seed them out there about 4 per inch. And then after they're up and growing, about 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks post sprout, go through and thin and do it again 2 weeks later. Your ultimate goal is you want to get those carrots spaced at about 2 inches apart to finish out. If you are dry gardening them for any reason, maybe a little more, 3 to 4 inch separation is a good idea. Typical soils, those carrots will be tapping down much faster than the tops develop. You get a little bit this much green up, and you'll have several inches of root underneath it. They will tend to kind of push up their shoulders a bit, and you want to rebury those when you see those happening. Do cover those shoulders so they don't green. That will preserve the maximum amount of the carrot as harvestable. The green part of the carrots, when they green up, is not good. They can be dry gardened. Irrigation is optional. They do harvest easier if you give them a couple of good stiff waterings before you dig them, because of that taproot and the tendency to break. Digging into hard, dry soils and getting them out intact can be a challenge without any irrigation, but you don't have to water them. They grow dry fairly well. No nitrogen or very minimal nitrogen. So when we're prepping a site for carrots, we recommend, yes, a little compost in, but it's got to be fully broken down compost and maybe some sandy material. They like a bit of sand in their soils. But don't overdo the organic mass because you get forky and hairy roots. Same thing if you give them too much nitrogen. You get forky or hairy roots instead of good, nice, singular tap roots going down. So be cautious about too fresh of organic material that's still decomposing, about too much organic material, or about too much nitrogen in the soil. Early plantings will probably never have a carrot rust fly problem. You're planting them in April and even May. I've never had an issue with carrot rust fly. But summer plantings for fall harvest and fall plantings for overwinter harvest, this is a real issue. The carrot rust fly maggot is a serious problem on all the parsley family. So best bet on that is to get your seed out there and pay attention. The moment you start seeing any green, any little fringe of green coming up in that seeded patch, throw an insect barrier over it. And you keep that on for about 3 weeks after the first initial germination. The carrot rust fly maggots find the very baby seedlings, and they lay their eggs adjacent to or touching the stem right on the soil, and then the larva of the maggot burrows down into the taproot as it develops. So once the carrots get any size at all, they stop bothering. So to catch them early, prevent them early, you'll have it under control. And that's really the only effective means of control of carrot rust fly maggot. You can harvest at desired size. Even immature small carrots are edible if you want to go through the trouble of peeling them, or not. Nobody says you have to peel your carrots. Carrot peels aren't bad for you. Short cycle carrots like Mocoms are around 60, 65 days. The typical main season varieties run about 75, 80, maybe out to 90 days. And if you're growing the overwintered variety, you can grow the overwintered varieties as spring for summer harvest too, and they're shorter, they're like 75 days. But if you do them in September for an overwintered crop, it's about 200 days roughly from seed to harvest. Good estimation, depending a little bit on what soil temperatures are actually at in your individual area. One of the things I love about carrots is the overall yield per investment. You can get as much as 4 pounds of carrot per square foot if you have a really good run on them. And carrots store quite well. So kind of like beets, get them out of the ground, cut the tops off, get them thoroughly washed and cleaned, let them get very nice and air dry, and then store them in a humid, cold environment like refrigerator compartment, fruit compartment. And I mean, I've still got carrots from August digging in the fridge. They're just fine. Yeah. So garlic, we'll talk about garlic, we'll talk about onions, but one of the things they share in common is they don't care how long they've been in the ground. Their regulation of their growth cycle is by day length. So you can plant garlic on the traditional cycle in the fall. It's really the best way to grow them and grow them over the winter. But you can take garlic cloves and plant them all the way through March and still get garlic. You just get less garlic and less clove size out of them. They're one of the easier root crops to grow. And they're one of the great introductions to winter over winter gardening because they have so very few problems. Usually, if you're having issues with your garlic, you're having less success. You're not having crop failure. So a very successful, good introduction to the winter garden. So what you see there in the picture are finished cloves or finished bulbs of garlic, and each bulb is made up of several cloves. And so when you're planting them, you pull those bulbs apart, you plant the individual cloves, and each individual clove will regrow a new bulb like that. Plant the individual cloves approximately 5 or 6 inches apart. You'll get a lot of variables on what people recommend that. No closer than 4, wider than 6 is inefficient. This is a good crop to do in rows because you're going to plant quite a bit of it, and it's going to be in a fairly dense layout. And certainly you could go on a 6 by 6 inch spacing, but then you have this problem of crowding and getting smaller clove size. So if you go more like in a row 6 inches apart and then 15 to 18 inches between rows, now you have workable space to work around them, and you have less overall competition from each to each, resulting in the best yield. They're hungry. The whole allium group is notably nitrogen hungry. Even though they're a bulb crop, how much bulb they get is very much determined by how much leaf mass they put out. So plenty of nitrogen is very essential. Broadly, you can break garlic into 3 types: hardneck, softneck, and the elephant garlic. Elephant garlic is not truly a garlic. It's a type of leek. It just grows like a garlic, so we treat it basically the same. So hardneck garlic have a smaller number of relatively large cloves, and then they have that hollow center where the hard stem comes out. That's the hard neck part, and that's where the flower stem came out. Plant all the cloves of those. They typically have really great flavors, good yields, and really great peelability. They're easier to peel, but they don't store for long periods of time. You might get 3 or 4 months post-harvest of storage out of them. That's all. Softneck, on the other hand, have a congestion of bulbs into the center. So your outer cloves are still really good, but they get progressively smaller and smaller, and the entire center is filled up with little bulbs. Normally for planting those, we will plant the bigger cloves, and we will just save the last fringy stuff in the center and just put it in the kitchen and eat it. They have good flavors still and high yields, but a variable clove size, but they store. Softnecks can store for a year. 8-10 months is really common. Usually at home I plant some blending thereof, so I have some hardnecks because I really enjoy them, but I also have a consistent supply of garlic well into the season. Elephant garlic has a very small number of very, very, very large cloves with a very mild flavor. I mostly don't bother growing it because I like a richer garlic flavor, but the yield is huge, and they store like a hardneck or like a softneck, so they've got pretty good storage life. They look like a hardneck. They have that flower spike that comes out the center. So typical planting is done in the fall, and separate out the cloves into your prepared site. Basically, you want 2 inches of soil over the top of the bulb, which means you're digging a trough that's something around 4 inches deep to plant them in. 2 inches over the top of the bulb, fertilize well, putting a nice light layer of mulch over the top of that and compost mulch over the top of that finished planting is ideal. Planted from fall, they will start growing essentially immediately. Sometime in October, early November, you'll start seeing the greens starting to poke up, and they'll grow very slowly and incrementally from there over the winter. So we feed them well at planting, and we want to feed them again about 5 or 6 weeks after, but we're using organic granular fertilizers. Organic granular fertilizers diminish in their effectiveness in the coldest part of the year because of lack of soil microbial activity. So what we like to do is give them a nice dose of a liquid organic fertilizer in November, and then they'll go through a slow down through December and January, and sometime around mid to late February, you'll notice they're starting to really push faster again. Give them another dose of a liquid fertilizer at that point. Then in March, as the weather has warmed up enough that the granular fertilizers work well again, side dress them with a new dose of granular fertilizer, and that will get them through to harvest, which is usually June-ish. That varies a little bit from variety to variety. Typically, fall plantings don't need to be watered in, and you don't obviously need to water them over the winter here unless you're growing them under a cover for some reason. But sometimes we dry out fast enough in the spring to give them a little bit of supplemental water during the growing cycle, and that's not a bad thing to do. If we're getting substantially dry in April, look into watering them. So as I said before, the day length is what determines their initial bulb development, and that will kind of limit their finishing point. What you'll see is that sometime, usually in May, you'll see that they're beginning to yellow down. So from the very bottom leaves, you start seeing those yellow, and then it will be slowly progressing up, even with good fertilizing, even with consistent watering. That's normal. That's a sign that they're finishing. At that point, stop watering completely. You're about 2 to 3 to maybe 4 weeks to harvest at that point, and if you can get them to dry, they'll start the curing process, they'll finish their sizing, and they'll develop several layers of paper on the outside of those bulbs, which will make them store better, so better for storage. You can assume somewhere between 5 and 7 pounds of garlic harvested per pound of seed garlic planted. When you get them out of the ground, don't wash them, don't trim them. Lift them, get them spread out I don't like to start them in the sun. I like to get them like in my garage. Spread them out on sheets of cardboard in the garage where they've got decent air circulation, no direct sun, and moderate temperatures. They're not 100 degrees, but they're not 40 degrees. And it will take about 3 weeks post-harvest for them to be cured to where they've kind of finished the hardening process for storage. At that point, then you can trim the roots off. You can trim the tops or re-wet the tops and braid them if that's your thing. And once they're in that stage, they're capable of storing. You want to be dry, dark, and moderate temperatures, neither freezing nor quite room temperature for good storage. Hardnecks, 3 months roughly, and soft necks easily out to 8 months. So onions are kind of similar in the sense of being day length regulated. What that means is there's a whole batch of different onions that key to different day lengths. So it's very important, given that we are northern gardeners, not southern gardeners, that we use either long day onions or intermediate day onions. So the options are for bulbing onions are short day onions, which initiate at something less, usually around 8 to 10 hours of sunlight. Intermediate day onions that usually initiate bulb formation between 12 and 14 hours of day length. And then long day onions, which initiate bulb development at 14 plus, usually 14 to 16. So what happens if you try to do short day onions here is they're trying to set their bulb at the wrong time and they don't develop appropriately. So you don't get good onions out of it. And the reverse is true in the South. They can't grow long day. They have to grow short day onions. There's a lot of different ways you can plant onions. Some of them are easier than others, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail a little further down. So variety selection, sweets, Walla Wallas, yellow Spanish sweet, white sweets are common sweet onions that are long day onions. There are also some intermediate day onions that have sweet characteristics, notably candy is a good solid one for that. Storage onions aren't as mild and mellow in flavor, but they hold. Sweet onions just don't hold for any length of time. So storage onions include things like Pattersons and Copras, Ebenezer's, Yellow Rocks, and there's quite a batch of them. So a fun thing to consider is doing intermediate day onions because a lot of the intermediates are sweet-ish. They're on the sweet end, but store better than sweets. So it might give you some options for it to kind of have a bit of the best of both worlds. In my world, I grow storage onions. The sweetness really doesn't matter that much to me. I'm mostly cooking with them, not eating them raw. And the storability is critical because we do try to live on my garden pretty much. So relatively easy crop. They are grown over the winter. They will tolerate a fair amount of water, but you can't be a situation where they're actually underwater in the winter. That is a problem for them. So drainage just needs to be at least reasonable. Basic planting methods. From seed, I do not recommend direct sowing. They really require a pretty high soil temperature for germination. And because they're day length regulated, you're unlikely to direct sow them in the spring and have a decent crop. Less of an issue with bunching onions and scallions, but for the bulb forming onions, that's a thing. If you're going to start from seed, you want to start your seed in seedling trays inside for transplant out. So you start your seedlings now inside, roughly February, for transplanting out late March or early April, as the soil temperatures are warming up. The other end of the cycle, and probably more common commercially, is to start your seedling trays inside because you can control the water better in July for transplanting August to September and then grown as an overwinter cropping. And that's what gives you the big onions, is the overwinter development. So with that being said, you can get seed, and that gives you more variety choices. A number of wholesale growers produce seedling trays of a number of varieties you can buy in the nurseries, and you can plant out that way on your own. But you can also do storage onions from sets. So sets are somebody's grown on the first cycle of the onion growth and then let it dormant down to a hard bulb, a storage set. And that's ready to replant directly in the garden late summer to fall. And actually all the way from that point through to March, technically, you have that window, although again, the earlier the better. And they're really easy to plant sets, are really easy to handle. Because they've gone through a kind of a growing cycle and then a storage cycle, they have a lot of stresses on them. They have a higher incidence of bolting, of setting a flower, and bolting is not desirable on onions. You know, it doesn't matter in garlic, but it does in onions. But sets are available for storage onions only because sweet onions don't develop that type of a storage set for handling. If you want to do sweet onions without all the seed work, you get bunches. Bunches they just came in. They're available basically from the middle of February through early to mid-March. And they're just literally, somebody's done that seed growing stage for you and grown them out to a start. And it's a start that's small diameter and maybe a few inches long. And they've bare rooted them. So you buy a whole bunch of them and they're just really quickly ready to plant. So sets plant relatively shallow compared to garlic. You only want a 2 or 3 inch trench depth, and you only want about 1 inch of soil over the top of them. Bunches, you want to look very carefully at. You're normally digging your trench about 2 to 2.5 inches deep, and you're setting those bunches out, and you're burying them just up the stem. So if you look at that, you've got a root system, and then a little tiny pseudobulb, and then white stem, and then this kind of papery sheath, and then the green leaves coming out of the sheath. You want about a good inch, or even a little bit more, of that papery sheath still showing above the soil at planting. After planting onions, it's okay to lightly mulch with the donut method in mind. Do not bring compost mulches in contact with the greens. Just mulch in a circle around or side dress the rows. Typical pattern is to plant them in rows. So you're planting your onions around 4 to 5 inches apart with a spacing of something around 15 inches again between the rows. Your Fall plantings of sets can be watered in, but may not need it. Again, the rains come in. That summer seeding, direct sowing outside is really difficult. That's why I do recommend you start them inside. It's really hard to keep onion seed wet enough for good germination in August. That's July and August. So day length determines the finish, which means that sometime in roughly June, you'll see kind of the same thing that happens with garlic. You'll see them starting to get a little yellow and the tops will start flopping. The moment you see that happening, stop watering entirely. This will enable the paper to form again on the outside of the bulb and will substantially decrease any risk of storage rots, which are kind of a bit more of a problem with onions than they are with garlic. If you get a flower spike out of your onion, simply dig that individual onion immediately and use it quickly. It's not going to really continue developing and it's not going to store. That's not a complete failure, but it's a partial failure at that point. And it's usually, I mean, it's probably understood what really initiates the flowering cycle then, but it's usually related to some variable stresses. So like getting too hot and too cold, or getting too wet and too dry, or some admixture of that seems to be the stresses that tend to trigger bolting. Your onions will tend to shoulder up as they grow. They'll push themselves up out of the ground and you'll have this dome of onions showing. Do not bury them. They don't need it. If you feel like you really want to protect them a little bit, okay, bring a little bit of compost or soil up over the shoulders, but well away from that central stem. Do not bring anything in contact with that central stem. So as those tops wilt down, you stop watering, 2 weeks maybe, you can go out and dig them. Good general rule of thumb is the same as garlic. Dig them in the cool part of the day. Do not wash. Get them spread out and air dry in a controlled, moderate temperature, darkish environment with good air circulation. Let them dry down. Then you can trim the roots. Then you can trim the tops and store them for longer term use. Usually takes about 3 weeks to cure. So sweet onions don't store, meaning you'll get weeks to a couple of months. You might stretch that out to 3 or 4 months if you wrap each individual one in a paper towel and put it in the fridge. That cold storage actually will give you some storability on sweet onions. Do not do that to your storage onions. It ruins your storage onions. They start rotting from the inside out. So for storage onions, just get them good and dry and store them at nice moderate temperatures and preferably dark. Typical harvest varies quite a bit, and it's real common for me to be seeing, from variety of varieties, real common for me to be seeing like Walla Wallas coming out of my garden June, July, but storage onions often a little bit earlier for me, mid to late June. You can ground store onions pretty darn well for the most part. Just pick out what you want over the summer. Just remember that there are insect pests, rodents like onions as well. And eventually the rains come in and you don't want to have a lot of onions still sitting in the field and getting wet again because that will ruin their storability. Parsnips. Okay, the thing about parsnips, if you enjoy them, it's not one of my favorite crops, but it's about what you do with them. They're an incredibly long production cycle crop. It takes forever to get parsnips. They require a lot of depth. Minimum is 12 inches, but more is definitely better. 15 to 18 inches is nominal for developing parsnips. Typically, if you are planting your parsnips from seed, which is the deferred method, is direct sowing. If you're planting them in your primary growing cycle in May, June, maybe into early July, you'll be harvesting them in the winter. They take the entire growing cycle to develop. They are a carrot family, a parsley family member. They take a very, very long time to germinate. A lot can happen. So the same basic rules apply for carrots. You sow them relatively dense, not as dense as carrots. Half-inch apart's good. 4 to 8 per inch is a little excessive. Very lightly covered, 1/8 inch over the top with a non-crusting soil. Keep them consistently well watered during their germination cycle, which is still about 3 or 4 weeks of germination. Keep cats off them during that period, and then you'll thin them down later in the season for broader spacing for development. A number of good varieties out there. Lancer and Gladiator are some of the newer stuff out there. You still see a lot of the old white spears and such, and they're all pretty similar and pretty solid. What you'll find is that there are a number of them that are a bit shorter maturing, and then the old classics all are quite long. So if you're really thinking about fall harvest, look for some of the varieties that are maybe slightly faster to develop. So they need a reasonable amount, like so many of the root crops. They need lots of phosphorus and potassium, but they need a reasonable amount of nitrogen. They're not as hungry as alliums, but they're out there, so make sure they have some. When they're about 3 inches tall or so, thin them down to about a 4-inch or maybe a 5-inch spacing to finish out. Deep watering. It's less important to water them frequently once you're past germination, but it is important that you're putting enough water down that the water goes down into the soil so that you're actually getting the depth of penetration. Carrot rust flies are still a problem, just like with carrots. And because this is almost exclusively done during the warm part of the season, it is a very good idea to cover with an insect barrier from first germination out for 2 to 3 weeks or so. 120 to 140 days is a typical crop cycle on parsnips. They ground store very solidly. This is a crop that you can be planting and harvesting as you need in October, November, December, even into January. They hold really well. They are subject to a number of insect pests in the soil, so bear that in mind. Yield is not high per square foot, 3/4 of a pound to a pound per square foot, but with that storage capability, it's still quite well worth doing. Dig them at ready point in the fall or winter, wash them thoroughly, top them, and let them get nice and air dry before refrigerated storing. In cold, humid, and storage conditions, they last for a very long time. They're eminently storable. Potatoes are kind of a classic root crop. You can plant if your soil is workable and not too saturated. You could theoretically plant as early as maybe second week of March. They will tolerate the temperatures just fine if you're not too sopping wet. When you buy seed potatoes, you're going to cut them into chits, planting chits. So you will look at that seed potato for eyes or eye forms, little indentations where the eyes can come out. The eyes are simply the new growth emerging. And you want to cut it into that tuber into sections that have 2 or 3 eyes per piece. Yes, if you were doing this for a grand scale of minimum investment of materials per square foot, you could theoretically take that down to very small chits at 1 eye per piece, but there's a percentage of failure that happens from that. The average home gardener would rather have most of them take rather than extend the amount of planting they can do out of a single tuber. Cut them before you plant them. I like to do it about a day ahead. And then you put them out not in the sun, in a darker location and at room temperature, and they'll callus over. When you first cut into that tuber, it's all just like cutting into a potato. It's all glistening wet. But in just a couple of hours, you'll see it starting to kind of dust up and dry out. And over several hours, it will develop a little bit of a leathery callus where you cut it. By letting them callus before you plant them, you're reducing the risk of getting rots in right away to the planting chit before it has a chance to sprout out and develop. Rots later don't matter, but rots before you get good sprouting do. Very easy crop all in all, very adaptable to a variety of soil conditions, and it will even tolerate some shade. Usually, again, this is a situation where you don't have crop failures, you have relative degrees of success depending on how well you're doing with them. A very traditional method of growing potatoes is to plant your chits something like 18 to 24 inches apart in long straight rows. This is really common agriculturally. My father likes to garden that way, and it works very, very effectively if you have the space. I don't have that kind of space. I plant my chits about 10 inches apart in broad mounds. You want to have those chits planted something around 3 to 4 inches deep in the soil in a well-prepared site. Now, this means really digging down. You really want to get that soil prep under them so they have a chance to push both tops up, but also develop root masses down. An exception to the rule for spring plantings, a lot of things we say water them in even if you're not really needing water because it's raining. Do not water in your potato chits at planting. Let the natural rainfall soak into them slowly after you've planted them and let them sprout. Now, if you're dry after the first leaves have broken surface, yeah, you can water then, but wait until you see some leaves before you start adding water. Again, reduces the risk of rot. Lots of good varieties and lots of variability. So typically you plant all of your potato varieties all at the same time, and you plant different varieties with different lengths of harvest cycle to have a spread out harvest. The thin-skinned types, and thin-skinned yellows and reds, have moderate storage for most of them, and your thicker-skinned or russet types tend to hold much longer post-harvest. Quick maturing varieties might be as quick as maybe 60 to 65 days from planting to potato. Things like Yukon Gold are in that range. Intermediate potatoes are typically something around 80 or maybe at most 90 days to harvest. And there's a lot of longer term, and particularly your storage varieties, and fingerling potatoes, like French fingerling, that take 100, 110, 120 days. I don't grow a lot of those. I just don't have the patience for putting that much garden space into a root crop in the main growing season. Things that I'm going to harvest winter to fall, it's a different story, but things that are actually occupying main garden space, I just don't have the patience, because that really means that by the time I'm getting those potatoes out of the ground, I really don't have time to follow them with the fall crop. There's just not enough season left. 80-day potatoes, yeah, I can get those out of the ground and still have that space in July, August, and still get a fall or winter crop into that location. So moderate balanced fertilizers, they really do need a reasonable amount of nitrogen as well as phosphorus and potassium. Typically, as they push up, you'll see that they grow a lot of very vertical growth with leaves going up and up and up. There are two types of potato broadly. There are potatoes that are indeterminate, potatoes that are determinate. So determinate potatoes are your earlies, and you don't gain anything by burying those tops as they come. But indeterminate potatoes, the russets and some of those other long cycles, if you will bury those tops a couple of times and make them push more, they'll root along that stem, and then you'll get more space for potatoes to grow on and more overall yield. So storage types, like russet types, you can hill up, but the thin-skinned and early types, you really shouldn't. Even if you're mounding up with straw or compost or native soil, don't do that more than a couple of times. It does slow down an already kind of delayed harvest cycle. Be aware of that. A number of insect pests we worry about on potato. Beetles being the biggest problem. There's a number of beetles, including cucumber beetles and flea beetles, that do a lot of damage to the leaves. The damage that's done to the leaves is reflected in substantially reduced growth. And those beetles often transmit a fair number of viral diseases. So do leafhoppers, uncommon but sometimes substantial pest in our area. If you're seeing insect damage on your potatoes, organic insecticides, neem, pyrethrin, very effective. Spray in the evening as close to dark as you can manage for good insect suppression. They can be dry cropped. I often dry crop at least some of my potato crop. On the other hand, you're already spacing things broader in a dry crop situation. You're already spacing potatoes broad, which means potatoes dry crop take up quite a bit of space. You'll get better yields off of relatively consistent deep watering. They're by no means a thirsty crop though, so put them on the perimeters of your irrigation profile. It's a really good idea to let them get at least a little dry between waterings. Don't be watering them every day. They tend to have a lot higher tuber rot problem if they're constantly wet than if they're drying out a little bit in between. You'll notice that most of them will start to flower at some point. They'll send at the top of their growth, they'll send either a little yellow or either white or little purplish flowers. And that's a sign that they're hitting the end of their growing cycle. They're reproducing. They're also setting their tubers. It's a good idea to increase the water at that point for better tuber size. On the other hand, right after that flowering cycle, usually about 2 weeks after flower, you'll see the yellowing of the leaves starting at the base and interior and kind of slowly working their way up. And that's beginning again at the end of the growing cycle. So once you see that leaf yellowing substantially progressing, stop watering so that the tubers dry out and the skins harden up. That will improve your storability. You can harvest little baby potatoes shortly after, right about the time you're cutting off water, a couple of weeks after flowering, but they'll be small, but it's fun to have some really fresh potatoes really early in the growing cycle. They'll still finish sizing on a little bit past that, and you'll get bigger and bigger if you wait a little bit longer. General rule of thumb for harvest is once they've died back or have mostly died back, you can dig them in the cool part of the day, wash them thoroughly, air dry them, and then store them in a relatively dry, moderate temperature and dark location for long-term storage. Thin-skinned, fresh types, Yukon Golds, a lot of the reds, might store for several months after that. Russets can store for 8, 10 months. They can last you all the way through pretty much to the next harvest. Fingerlings are also, for the most part, pretty good storing varieties. Radishes are a fun crop and a quick crop. Don't overplant radishes. They mature extremely fast. How much are you going to eat? It's not a high consumption level crop. You can theoretically start seeding radishes as early as March. They do much better in April after we've got a little more soil temperature. And you can continue to sow them continuously in small batches all the way through early September. So plant frequent small batches. Seed to harvest on most radish varieties is about 3 to 4 weeks. So very quick turning crop. Consider utilizing that in your growing techniques. So when we talk about carrots sprouting at 3 to 4 weeks, parsnips sprouting at 3 to 4 weeks, well, if you plant your carrots and then you go through and you plant radishes right on top of them, the radishes come out fast, develop up. By the time you're harvesting your radishes, your carrots are just beginning to sprout, and the radishes have done the first stage of thinning by spacing them out a little bit. That's a valuable double cropping the same space, and it's a technique you might play with. It also, the developing radishes tends to protect those carrots and parsnips from cats and other, even drying down and such, the canopy of leaf. They do need consistent watering during their brief germination cycle, and they will taste better if your watering is consistent, not getting dried out heavily between waterings. They get hot if they get dried out too much. So like most of the Brassica family of root crops, they need a fairly substantial supply of nitrogen in addition to their phosphorus needs. They sprout fast, so thin them early. They finish fast too. You want to thin them to between 2 and 3 inches apart really early in the season in their development cycle. Consistent watering, especially if we're warming up and drying out. Early plantings may not need much with that quick of a turnaround, but if you're planting in June or July, yeah, you're going to need to water them during their growing cycle. Aphids are a problem on all brassica crops. We know that. Beetles are a disaster on radishes and many of the other brassicas as well, particularly flea beetle. Aphids can be controlled with water streams and careful policing. You're not going to probably control beetles by the time you notice damage. Neem is a solid insecticide for organic insecticide for beetle control because it has a several day duration on the leaf, and it's relatively low in toxicity to bees. Again, apply in the evening. These beetles are primarily nocturnal or cool part of the day active, and your pollinators and good bugs are primarily hot part of the day active. And if you can get out and do your spraying in the cool part of the evening as we're getting close to dusk, you'll have much less non-target spray and you'll have much better control of the pests you're trying to control. So usually 4 or 5 weeks post-seeding, you will be harvesting and dig them, wash them, top them. Topping is optional. I like to because otherwise they kind of rot in storage, and I don't use a lot of radishes, so I do hold on to them for very long periods of time. Storage even under refrigeration is not great. 4 or 5 weeks is a really good run on radishes in the refrigerator. Shallots, another allium family crop. Very similar in most regards. Some differences. Plant shallots shallow. Easy mnemonic. Shallots go shallow. When I say shallow, I mean I plant my shallots with just a little bit of the tip of the bulb showing. That shallow. They hate wet soil. They hate heavy soils. So plant them shallow and then just mulch over the top. Space them well, again, 4, 5, or 6 inch spacing and 18 inches between rows, just like traditional allium crops. And then mulch them lightly over the top of those tips so that they have some cover. Planting in fall for June harvest is the norm. For me, my shallots usually finish ahead of my onions and a bit ahead of my garlic on average. There's only a couple real types. You'll see, and there's several name varieties within that, but they're not all that different beyond that. So French are subtle and nuanced in flavor, delicate and a joy to cook with. Dutch are distinctively bolder and more pungent, more noting the onion characteristic of the family. Jersey shallots aren't shallots, they're shallot onion crosses. I don't bother because there's no particular gain versus planting onions in my mind in terms of flavor. So what happens with shallots is you plant that bulb and they'll grow up right away, just the standard overwinter growing pattern. And they will push up just like onions do, and let them push up. That's just fine. But each of those bulbs will provide a cluster, as you see in the picture here, a cluster of finished bulbs at harvest. You will see them begin to yellow as they near ripening again. It is optional to dry them down because they're usually pushed up pretty high. I prefer to dry them down at least briefly, like a week before harvest, just to get a little more paper on. But they're not a complex crop. They're just a picky crop. Good fertilization, just like all the alliums. Fall planting over winter for early summer harvest. But they don't like poor drainage at all. They hate heavy clay, which makes them a real challenge in my garden. They do great in raised beds. These are a great raised bed crop. As they go in through the growing season, they resent drying out. So you just got to kind of keep on top of them. They lift much easier than other alliums. You often don't need to dig them. You simply pull them out of the ground. Don't trim or wash them until they're cured, just like onions and garlic. It takes 2 to 3 weeks at most to get them cured. And then you can clean them up for long-term storage. Overall storage, cool, dark, and dry will give you pretty good storage life on that, several months. Turnips and rutabagas are extraordinarily similar crops, so we're going to treat them together. Essentially identical needs. The primary difference is how big they get and how long it takes. So they're a long cycle crop, even in the case of turnips, and quite a bit longer in the case of rutabagas. Typically planted in July for harvest, fall, and into winter. Turnips are easy enough and quick enough. You can do a spring crop. A planting done in April will harvest midsummer, July-ish, and that's certainly doable. On the other hand, I normally don't bother because they make such a great fall crop. The normal pattern for turnips and rutabagas is direct sowing. You plant the seed right in the soil where you're going to grow them, about 1 inch apart and shallow, but not on top, 1/4 inch to maybe 1/2 inch deep. That being said, you know you're going to be thinning them because you see how big they yield when you get them out of the ground. Watering needs to be consistent during germination. The good news is it doesn't take as long as it does for carrots or parsnips, so you're not going to be doing it forever. But this becomes really important for those July plantings in particular. Can you grow seedlings and transplant them? Yes, you can. I've done that, especially with rutabagas. It's a bit challenging in terms of investment per return and in terms of handling them young enough to not have an already stressed plant. So when you're doing that, you start your own carefully and you plan on transplanting in about 4 weeks, 5 weeks. When you're buying commercial transplants, you just need to get nice fresh ones because if they've been in those trays for very long, they're likely to have blunted, bent the tips, or have other problems in transplant. Varieties, you still see a lot of the traditional rutabagas, but Joan and Marion are both substantially improved varieties. Purple white top is still the classic turnip. There certainly are others out there, but there's not a huge amount of variation in quality or consistency between them. So, like most Nebraska root crops, surprisingly nitrogen hungry. A nice balanced fertilizer is in order, and thin them early because they need that space to develop right. So once you're at 2 to 3 true leaves, it's time to thin them. So turnips I would thin to about 6 inches, but rutabagas go all the way to 8 inches. They are a bigger crop all in all. Summer grown turnips and rutabagas need to be consistently watered even post germination. These are not carrots. They won't find their own way. You need to consistently water until the fall rains take over. And like all Nebraska crops, beetles and aphids are a huge problem. Now, one thing we don't run into that much in radishes with a quick turnaround, though we see it occasionally, we see a lot in turnips and rutabagas, is cabbage root maggot. Think of carrot rust fly maggot, but for cabbages. They even do non-root forming brassicas. Getting your cauliflower and broccoli established in the summer is sometimes challenging because these maggots get in there and they just decimate the root systems of those crops. So again, the ideal control is simply to cover as soon as you have the first germination and keep them covered for about 2 to 3 weeks after sprouting. Typically, you want to harvest when they're at a reasonable size. Really big ones are not really good. Turnips, that means around 3 or 4 inches. Rutabagas bigger. 6-inch rutabagas, even out to 8 inches, is not at all unheard of and usually holds quality well. Turnips will hit that size in about 60, 70 days, but rutabagas will take 100 to get their actual maturity. Can you harvest your rutabagas small? Yes, you can. That's not really a problem. Both ground store, but particularly rutabagas ground store really well, but ground dwelling insects like wireworms are a serious problem in trying to ground hold them. So weigh your options at that point. My normal in my soil, because I'm in a fairly wet soil and because I rotate really readily, is to get them out. Because the wireworms in that wet soil are a problem, as wet, high organic mass soils tends to breed a lot of wireworms. If you're in a raised bed or a better drained soil, you might be able to get away with ground storing them well into the winter. In theory, rutabagas is a crop that you can be harvesting out of the ground in January. It's one of the few that's the case of. Half a pound per row foot of harvest is kind of typical yields. They do store reasonably well, rutabagas quite well. So don't go too light on the harvest, on the planting. You can make good use of them. Dig them, top them, wash them, air dry them, store them in the refrigerator, cool, humid environment. All right, everybody's been waiting for the sweet potatoes. The sweet potatoes have an unfair reputation for being difficult to grow here. You can't grow every type of sweet potato here. You have to grow varieties that are relatively quick maturing varieties. Georgia Jet, Covington, Centennial, and Murasaki Purple have been some of my best ones. Beauregard has been another good one. This is a crop that is done from slips. So you have an existing root and you start slips by letting them sprout in water, and then you cut sections off, plant them out into a pot, start growing the plant, then transplant it in the garden. You can do all that at home. It's a pain. I buy slips. It's just not worth it to me. Part of the reason it's not worth it to me is timing is important. You cannot put your sweet potatoes out early. They need to be after the soil has really warmed. This means May to June. But if you miss that window, you don't have enough time to finish them. So I just buy slips and plant them that way. Do a very, very large, broad hole that is very, very, very deep. When I say that, I'm saying I dig my holes about 18 inches deep and maybe 24 or more inches across for each slip. Thoroughly amend with lots of compost and give them a good dose of fertilizer. Plant the slip at the finished soil level they came in at. Don't overbury them, and let them develop out. They are huge. They are massive plants. You need to plant on about 16 square feet per plant, so 4 foot by 4 foot square, and that's minimal. You'll have vines exceeding that. You can just kind of control them outside that. Within that 4 foot by 4 foot area, you are committed to only that plant. Nothing else can be grown there. It's not a bad idea. They're really warm crop plants. It's not a bad idea to put an underlay on the soil to help speed up the soil about a week ahead of planting, then cut slits through it, plant through it, and leave that fabric mulch on top to increase the heat of the soil. And that does help them fairly substantially. So feed well. They need a good balanced fertilizer. Now, water consistently deeply all summer. That's the conventional wisdom on sweet potatoes, and that's what we've always done with them. I have 3 years now of doing sweet potatoes in unirrigated gardens. And yes, as long as you get them well established in a timely fashion, they yield just fine in a dry garden situation. You'll find it a little bit more variable in how good a success you have, and it will affect your yield. I get about half the yield in sweet potatoes in the dry garden that I do in the irrigated garden. Water them consistently, good idea for size. If you are keeping them really wet, they will actually oversize, they will actually crack out, they deform a bit. Also, they do the same thing in heavy soils, they crack out and deform a bit. So bear in mind it may impact your quality a bit, though even those rough looking sweet potatoes are just fine once you go through the trouble of cleaning them up and peeling. Harvest is the trick, really. Leave them in the ground as long as humanly possible. We need to get them out of the ground at first frost when the tips of the vines start dying back, or conversely, if it comes first, whenever we're starting to get a substantial amount of fall rains and we're worried about rotting them in the field. Dig them very gently and carefully. Start at the outside of that area you prepped, well away from the crowns. Cut all the vines off first, and then get in there and gently dig around the outside. I use a fork rather than a spade for this. And start kind of turning small amounts of soil, digging slowly down and in. You might find tubers 3 feet away from the crown, shallow, usually angled down, but shallow. Sometimes you'll find tubers starting right underneath the crown and going down another 8 or 10 or 12 inches below the crown. They'll be all throughout there, randomly distributed throughout that root system. Do not handle, do not wash, do not drop them in the bucket. Even though they look and feel really solid, they're actually really delicate at this stage. So you want to handle them as little as possible in the course of getting them out of the ground. Step back for just a moment. Damaging the vines. If you're walking on the vines, you're roughly retraining the vines, or you're trimming the vines during the growing season. Every part where they then are laying on the ground, they will try to set little roots along those runners to make up for that injury, just toughen them up. And when that happens, you get a whole batch of little sweet potatoes and no big sweet potatoes all along where those vines are rooting in. So avoid injuring the vines during the growing season as well. So once you've got those out of the ground, they need an extensive curing process before they are ready to eat, before they are sweet. You could eat them, but they're not sweet until they've had curing. It's a little different from curing alliums. Room temperature, upper end room temperature, 70 degrees, 75 degrees is great. Dirty, don't wash them, don't handle them, just get them warm, and you leave them like that for about 3 to maybe 4 weeks. Reasonable humidity is important during this curing process for sweet potatoes. If you've got a very, very dry location, like a drying rack, probably not ideal. They actually want a little more humidity. I use my laundry room. My wife loves it. Boxes of dirty. So I'll put cardboard boxes. I will layer them out so they're not touching, and I'll put a layer of newspaper, and I'll put either 2 or 3 layers at most in a box and put them in the laundry room and let them cure for 4 weeks. I don't ever actually wash them, even after they're cured. I find the risk of damage and the impact on the storage life is pretty darn significant. So I just wash them as I take them out to cook. And clean them up then. Store them warm. They don't no longer need to be at that 70-degree range, 75-degree range, but if you're dropping much below 65 where you're storing them, they'll start losing sugar. So keep them to the warm end for best flavor. These giant sweet potatoes, you don't need to cook them all at once. It's really common for me to cut one in half or even into thirds. Cook what I want, put the rest of them back in the box. It'll heal over. Yes, I sometimes get a little bit of storage damage after that point, but they typically hold well enough. If I'm not leaving them like that for another month or so, I'll get back to them reasonably soon. They'll hold again, and you can do them in segments because there's a lot of yield to those. And overall, a high yielding crop anyway. I mean, a slip can produce as much as maybe 25 pounds of sweet potatoes. This is kind of a maximum yield per slip. So very high yield. The storage life is great. Mine are showing no signs of sprouting at all right now. And likely I'll start seeing them sprouting in April or May. It's a little bit still usable at that point. If you've got them already sprouting, it's not too hard to start your own slips. I just don't find it worth the effort when I can buy them. Especially, I'm here all the time. I know when they come in. So that's the ins and outs of sweet potatoes, and don't despair. They are absolutely eminently growable here as long as you have the space and are willing to bend a little bit to their needs. So there's some minor root crops that are a lot of fun to grow and to play with. Aca is a personal favorite of mine. It's a tremendously high yield of very small tubers with a distinctive acidic flavor. Oxalicy, they're sharp in flavor. I love them. They saute up beautifully. Unfortunately, nobody else in my family gets all that excited about them, so I've kind of backed off from growing them. The thing about growing aca is once you plant it somewhere, you're not likely to get it completely harvested out and gone. They have hundreds and hundreds of these little microtubers where you plant them. So they're going to be persistent in that location. And this is one of the reasons that a lot of these minor crops are minor crops. They do tend to be persistent perennial crops rather than annual replant crops. Salsify and black salsify, and black salsify is so much better than traditional salsify flavor-wise. They're composites, sunflower family. And while they don't perennialize, they do set a dandelion-like puff of seeds that can spread them far and wide. Salsify is a horrible weed. Black salsify has not been that much of a problem here. Sunchokes, or Jerusalem artichokes, are big-leafed, 6 foot, 7 foot tall perennials with a big sunflower-like flower. They produce a very substantial root mass that is harvestable, and if you can also leave little bits in ground, and you will continually have a perennial stand that keeps coming back year over year over year. So that's kind of some typical minor crops, and you can read up a lot of those. There's a lot of people who grow them on a hobby. They're not really that commonly available for planting at the nurseries. Find somebody who's growing them, get your starts, or mail order some starts, and you'll have them forever. They're very durable. My neighbor has a batch of sunchokes planted along the property line, which I both enjoy and hate because they really are massive. But they are very persistent even with minimal care. So that's what we had for our root crop talk today. And I would just like to take any questions you have or any questions from any folks watching from home. Yes.
So I've read that growing onions, if you trim the greens, they will grow bigger.
Okay. So the question is, growing onions and do we trim the tops to increase the bulb size? Generally, no. So if you're looking at your bunches or your seedling transplants, you can tip them to make sure you don't have too much tip mass that's growing up. So once you get beyond 4 or 5 inches in the seedling tray, you want to tip them to make them more handleable. And in bunches, if you got any tearing or yellowing on the tip, you want to tip that back for control. Tipping them back during the growing season does not gain you any particular benefit, and it can actually reduce your yield size because, again, how much leaf mass they put out will determine how big the bulb gets. And it's not like they're putting energy into the leaf at expense of root development. That leaf mass is a critical component of developing them. So no, generally do not tip them. And when they hit the bending over stage, you can tie them up to tidy them with a rubber band or with string. You can tip them once they've gotten really soft. That's certainly an option at that point. You can take the tops out of them at that point. That's certainly an option. Don't go all the way down to the bulb if you're doing that. Just leave a nice stub up that you can harvest out and still cure. But there's not a lot of gain to doing that. Garlic has kind of the same thing in that, you know, we talk about flowering on onions, and that's a failure. Hardneck garlic will flower too, and you can cut that out. That makes no difference one way or the other. Theoretically, there's a micro difference in yield. If you don't let them put as much energy into flower development, it might increase your yield slightly. It's hardly measurable. On the other hand, those little flower spikes are quite flavorful, sautéed or stir fried. So it's something you might consider doing. Yes.
Yeah, so for some reason, I guess I thought potatoes, if you put too much nitrogen, they're just gonna get real leggy to start.
Yeah, so
I mean, in fact, I thought you don't really want nitrogen on potatoes.
So question, nitrogen in potatoes, you can overdo anything. Nitrogen, potatoes are a nightshade. They need a fair amount of nitrogen. That does not mean you're feeding them as much nitrogen as you're doing your tomatoes. Too much nitrogen will result in some greening, potentially some hollow spaces, and yeah, leggy growth. But no nitrogen is worse. So depending on your soil profile, if you're testing regularly, that's something you might consider. Typically, nitrogen tends to get used up pretty readily. So if you're in a site that you definitely have no nitrogen, definitely feed. If you've got a lot of residual soil nitrogen, they can go without. They're moderate need. Yeah, they're not a super hungry plant by any regards, even by root crop standards. Balanced fertilizers, some nitrogen, don't focus on nitrogen with potatoes. Yes.
At the beginning, you're going over the different classes, or which one is the most that you want to crop rotate?
Okay, question is crop rotation. Which families are super important? The super important families for crop rotation are the Brassica family, the Nightshade family, and the Allium family. The rest, you start looking at the various composites, the Morning Glory group, Genopods, not as critical. They just don't have the range or seriousness of problems, or the problems are fixable with a simple rotation and fallow out. But problems with Phytophthora rot on potatoes can give you a serious problem with tomatoes for several years. The white mold on alliums is a disaster. Black leg on crucifer crops is huge, and there's so many crucifer crops that are grown in your garden. So those are the 3 I worry about the most. The rest of them, a little more leeway for sure. I still like to practice good crop rotations in all my crops. Yeah.
So maybe I'm the only one that can't grow radishes, but they don't form the bulb, it's just long and white
Okay,
and bitter.
bitter, hot radishes that are long and white and don't actually bulb up. So number one, thinning. You got to get the spacing between them or they don't develop. Number two, moisture regulation. This is what happens if they get dried out substantially between waterings. And they're not very deep. They're not like a lot of these root crops that find water deep. I would look at those two situations first. If you're getting good leaf growth, the problem of lack of nitrogen is almost certainly not there. It's very unlikely that you're phosphorus deficient enough to have that be a problem. Check your soil pH. If you're too substantially acidic, you could be having a problem there with nutrient utilization. So worth looking into. All right, well, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you for attending.